An American nurse hid a wounded German soldier. Then her commander walked in. The night had turned the fields of France into something unrecognizable, a sea of smoke and trembling earth. The air smelled of iron, oil, and fear. Flares burst overhead like dying stars, staining the clouds red, revealing faces caked in mud and blood before sinking back into darkness. The wind carried whispers, prayers, curses, and names that would never be answered again. Claire moved through the ruin with her medical kit pressed to her chest. 23 years old, yet already carrying the eyes of someone twice that age. Her boots sunk into mud that wasn't just mud. She no longer flinched at gunfire, only at silence, because silence meant counting the dead. A burning truck crackled beside her, its heat brushing her face as she knelt beside a man whose uniform was more bandaged than fabric. "Hold on," she murmured, though he was already gone. Her hands kept working anyway, out of habit, out of denial. She pressed gauze, wiped blood, whispered lies of comfort. Around her, men screamed for mothers, for God, for morphine. Claire could only offer morphine. She paused once to breathe, to remember she still could. The flares faded, the battlefield dimmed to black. In the quiet that followed, even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Claire's heartbeat filled the space where the war had been. Then, a sound. Soft, fragile, almost swallowed by the wind. At first, she thought it was one of theirs, maybe a wounded soldier calling from the trenches. But it came again, weak, distant, wrong. A single word, drawn out by pain. She couldn't place it, but it wasn't English. Her pulse spiked. The stories she'd heard of enemy soldiers pretending to be wounded, of medics lured into the dark, raced through her mind. Her training was clear. Leave him, report it, stay alive. But something about the sound, the way it cracked like a child's broken whisper, rooted her in place. She turned toward the source. Beyond the collapsed fence, smoke drifted in ribbons. The faint moonlight glinted off something metallic, perhaps a helmet, perhaps a trick of the eye. She stepped forward slowly, one hand gripping the strap of her kit, the other brushing against the wall for balance. Every instinct screamed that this was madness. Yet the nurse inside her, the one who had spent 2 years stitching together men she'd never met, refused to move away from a voice in pain. She crouched near a pile of debris, straining to hear. The voice came again, a whimper this time, softer than before. The word carried a foreign lilt, tender and cracked. Wasser. Wasser. Water. The realization hit her like cold air, not one of theirs. A German. Her breath caught. The war had trained her to see the enemy as faceless, iron helmets, black crosses, soulless discipline. But in that moment, the sound wasn't a threat. It was human. And humanity was the one thing this night had almost erased. Claire exhaled, slowly, trembling. Then she whispered back into the dark. Dawn crept in without color. The battlefield lay quiet now, a graveyard of twisted steel and scorched uniforms. Claire moved through the fog with her coat pulled tight, her boots crunching over broken glass and empty shell casings. She followed the sound she'd heard in the night, half convinced it had been a dream. But something inside her, something stubborn and gentle, refused to let it go. Behind a farmhouse torn open by artillery, she found the barn. Its doors hung crooked, creaking like old bones in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with straw dust and the sweet, sick smell of rot. Light bled through bullet holes in the roof, painting the floor in thin, trembling stripes. Claire hesitated at the threshold, listening. Nothing. Then, faintly, a cough, followed by a pained groan. Her heart thudded hard enough to shake her breath. She stepped inside. A pitchfork leaned against the wall. A milk pail lay overturned, its rim rusted brown. Something moved beneath the hay in the far corner, slow, desperate. Claire's hand hovered near her belt, where no weapon waited. When she pulled the hay aside, she froze. A young German soldier lay there, his face white as linen, uniform soaked in blood at the shoulder. His helmet was gone, his blonde hair matted dark with dirt. He couldn't have been older than 20. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped, a plea without words. His eyes flicked open, blue and terrified. For a moment, Claire saw what the posters had taught her to see: the enemy, the threat, the invader. But the longer she looked, the harder that image was to hold. The boy's fingers clutched at his wound like a frightened child trying to hold himself together. He whispered again, "Bitte, Wasser, Wasser." The word slid through the air like something fragile. Claire's throat tightened. She looked around. There was an old bucket near the door, half filled with rainwater. She dipped her canteen into it and returned, kneeling beside him. His eyes widened as she lifted his head and held the water to his lips. He drank greedily, spilling most of it down his chin. When he was done, he whispered something she didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable: gratitude. "Don't thank me," she muttered under her breath, as if saying it could undo what she'd just done. She pressed her hand to his wound, felt the heat of infection. He flinched, but didn't pull away. His breath was shallow, rattling. Claire glanced toward the door. The right thing to do was clear: report him, alert the patrol. But the right thing felt wrong. If she left now, he would die before sundown. If she stayed, she'd be committing treason. The war outside was simple, black and white, uniforms and orders. But here, in this quiet barn that smelled of hay and blood, everything turned gray. She looked down at him again, and for the first time didn't see a German. She saw someone's son. All morning Claire's hands moved like a metronome, cleaning, stitching, bandaging, each motion automatic, each thought forbidden. She'd hidden the German deeper beneath the loft, wrapped his shoulder in linen she stole from the hospital tent. Every sound outside, the rumble of jeeps, the shouts of soldiers, made her pulse spike, yet still she returned. Inside that barn, the world was split in two. Outside, uniforms and orders. Inside, whispers and breath. As she worked, her mind drifted to the walls of the mess tent back at camp. The propaganda posters, bright and sharp, screaming commands in red ink. "He kills without mercy, so must you. One careless act of kindness can cost 1,000 lives." She remembered how easily she'd believed them, how comfortingly simple they'd made the war feel. Now she looked at the boy before her, Karl, as she later learned his name was. He flinched with every stitch, his jaw tight to keep from crying out. His face was pale, soft, impossibly young. When she pressed the bandage into place, he whispered again, "Danke." His voice trembled like a note held too long. The word struck her harder than gunfire. She didn't understand much German, but gratitude needed no translation. It unsettled her, because she'd expected hatred, or arrogance, or some hint of the enemy she'd been told to despise, but there was none. Just a boy who looked scared, sick, and grateful to be alive. She told herself it didn't matter. A nurse heals whoever is in front of her. That's what they taught in training. But even that justification felt fragile. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to care. As she rinsed her bloody hands in a tin basin, the water turned pink. She stared into it, remembering her brother's photograph tucked in her breast pocket, taken before he shipped out to the Pacific. What would he think if he saw her now tending to the very kind of man who might have killed his friends? The question burned, but no answer came. Only the sound of Karl breathing, shallow but steady. Outside, a radio crackled faintly from a passing jeep, a general speech distorted by static. "We fight monsters, and we must not forget what they are." The voice bled into the barn, sharp as glass. Claire listened for a moment, then turned it off. The silence afterward felt cleaner. For a long time, neither of them spoke. She adjusted his bandage, changed his dressings. His eyes followed her movements with quiet trust. It was then she realized how propaganda worked best, not by making you hate the enemy, but by making you forget they could suffer too. She glanced toward the door, where daylight spilled like mercy through the cracks. The world outside would call this betrayal. Inside, it simply felt human.
Pain took him. He clenched his fists until she touched his arm. Then he exhaled, trusting the quiet between them. One evening, rain began to fall, soft at first, then relentless, drumming against the roof. Claire lit a small lantern, its glow flickering against the wet wood. The air smelled of damp straw and iodine. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe without fear of being heard. Karl watched her as she worked, his gaze unsure, almost apologetic. Then, in broken English, she said, "You could tell. You do not." She looked up from the bandage, startled. His meaning was clear. She could report him. She hadn't. "I'm not doing this for you," she replied too quickly, her tone sharper than she intended. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. He smiled faintly, a small, tired curve of the lips. "For who, then?" She didn't answer. The silence between them stretched until the rain softened to a whisper. In that quiet, the war felt far away. No orders, no ranks, just two people breathing in the same damp air, pretending that mercy wasn't a crime. Before leaving that night, Claire paused at the door. She turned back once, watching him drift into uneasy sleep beneath the old horse blanket. His chest rose and fell in rhythm with the rain. The posters back at camp called men like him enemy. But under this roof, stripped of uniform and fear, he looked like every other wounded soul she'd tried to save. And for the first time, the walls that kept them hidden didn't feel like prison walls. They felt like protection.
The silence that followed was unbearable. The lantern hissed softly. Karl's breathing rasped in the background, shallow and uncertain. Ross stepped closer until his face was inches from hers. His voice dropped to a murmur. "You think Mercy will survive in this war? You're a fool, Monroe. You'll die for this." "Maybe," she said, steady now. "But at least it'll be for something that isn't hate." His hand clenched around the pistol. For a moment she thought he'd raise it, not at Karl, but at her. The seconds stretched thin as wire. Then slowly he lowered the weapon. He turned his gaze to Karl, the young man who had once been the face of an enemy, and exhaled, long and tired. "What's his name?" Ross asked quietly. "Karl." He nodded, almost to himself. "He doesn't look much like a monster." The words hung in the air like a confession neither of them wanted to own. Finally, Ross holstered his pistol and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, he paused. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "If he's still here, I'll have to report it." Then he left, the door slamming behind him. Claire stood frozen in the lantern's trembling light, the truth crashing over her. By dawn, one of them would have to disappear. The barn smelled of wet straw and metallic taste of fear. Claire felt the world narrow to the beat of her heart and the rasp of Karl's breath. Captain Ross stood a few paces away, his pistol at his side, his face carved with the hard lines of command. The lantern threw his shadow across the floor, turning his silhouette into an accusation. "You heard me," he said quietly, as if louder would break the spell. Claire's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what she had done. She stepped forward, the wooden crates creaking underfoot. "He was dying," she said. "He needed water. He needed—" Her voice broke, then steadied. "He needed a chance." Ross's eyes flicked to the photograph in Karl's hand, then back to the boy. Recognition passed over his face, a memory of a son. He inhaled, slow. "You know what rules we live by. You know what mercy costs here." "I do," Claire answered. "But what is the point of surviving a war that asks you to kill mercy?" The question echoed and found no easy answer. Karl shifted, pain etching his features. He raised a hand weakly and in halting English said, "Please, not war." The plea landed between them like a stone. Ross's jaw clenched. Gun in hand, he seemed poised between two duties, the letter of the law he had sworn to uphold and the heavier oath of a man who had watched too many live men become ghosts. Years of command had taught him hard choices, but the lines had blurred in ways he could not unsee. Then Claire did something brave. She stepped between Ross and Karl, palms open, her face lifted so he could see her eyes. "If you take him away," she said softly, "you kill something in me. You make me believe hate is worth more than a man's life. I can't live like that." Ross looked at her, and in that look Claire saw not only authority but exhaustion, a tenderness war had forced into hiding. For a long second, he simply stared. The pistol trembled in his hand. Finally, he let it lower. "All right," he said, voice rough. "You get one night. You take him across the river at dusk. No lights. If anyone asks, you were tending supplies." Claire's knees nearly gave. Relief and terror tangled inside her like two ropes. "Why?" she whispered. Ross turned away, facing the doorway, as if the answer belonged to the night. "Because once my boy wrote me that he wanted to bring back milk, not medals." He closed his eyes. "Because I remember what my mother looked like when she prayed. Because I am tired." Claire understood then that mercy could be a tactical decision, a quiet rebellion, an act of humanity disguised as obedience. She nodded quietly. The barn exhaled, the storm outside lessening to a soft patter. For a moment the war stood back. The sun bled into the horizon, a molten red dissolving behind the shattered tree line. Claire guided Karl through the reeds, her arm beneath his weight heavy yet determined. Each step toward the river felt like defiance, against the war, against orders, against the quiet voice of fear that had followed her since Normandy.
The world had narrowed to this, two figures moving through the twilight, hunted by silence. The river whispered ahead, swollen with rain. The current glimmered faintly in the half-light, gold fading to steel. Claire stopped to catch her breath. Karl's face was pale but calm, eyes fixed on the far bank, as if home itself waited beyond the fog. Almost there, she murmured, though neither knew where there was. He managed a faint smile. "You could be shot for this," he said, his voice weak but steady. "So could you," she answered, half smiling back. "Let's make it worth it." Behind them, thunder rolled, not from the sky but from distant artillery, echoing like the memory of everything they were escaping. They reached the bank. Claire knelt, tearing her skirt to wrap his wound tighter. Her hands moved automatically, practiced, gentle. She thought of the men she had lost, the ones who had called her angel before the light went out in their eyes. Perhaps this was her last act of grace, not for her country, not for orders, but for the fragile belief that kindness still mattered. Karl's gaze softened. "You are not what they said," he murmured. "What did they say?" "That Americans have no heart, only guns." Claire's throat tightened. "They say the same about you." The river hissed between them, carrying away the lies they'd been fed. A beam of light flashed from the opposite ridge. A patrol. Claire froze. The air turned brittle, soundless. In that instant, she pushed Karl toward the water. "Go," she whispered. "Now." He hesitated, eyes wide. "And you?" She shook her head. "Someone has to cover the tracks." For a moment, neither moved. Then Karl gripped her hand, not as prisoner and nurse, but as two souls tethered by what they had seen. His hand lingered a heartbeat too long, then slipped free. He waded into the water, each step vanishing into mist. Claire watched until his silhouette dissolved into the darkness, until the ripples flattened, and the world held its breath again. The patrol's light swept over the reeds. Claire dropped low, mud seeping through her clothes, pulse hammering. When the voices faded, she rose and looked to the empty river. He was gone, and yet something in her chest no longer felt empty. The night was silent, save for the steady rhythm of the current. Somewhere in that current, a German boy floated toward home, carrying with him a single act of mercy that might outlive the war itself. Claire turned back toward camp, where questions waited, but for now her heart was still, her conscience clean. The war ended months later, but for Claire Monroe, it never really did. She returned to her small Ohio town where church bells rang again, where people spoke of victory and rebuilding, of medals and heroes. Yet in her mind it was always dusk, the river, the fog, and the faint ripple where a boy had disappeared into freedom. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and lilies. Every face she tended now was American, but sometimes she caught herself searching for blue eyes that spoke broken English, for a quiet thank you whispered through pain. When she passed a mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The same uniform, the same ribbons, but a gaze older, quieter, hollowed by mercy. One morning, a letter arrived. The paper was thin, foreign, the handwriting uneven but careful. She hesitated before opening it. Inside were just a few lines, written in German, and beneath them, an English translation in uncertain pen. "I crossed. I lived. I have a son now. He knows your name." It was signed simply, Karl. Her breath caught. The world seemed to tilt. She traced the letters with trembling fingers, as if the ink itself were a pulse. Outside, a train whistle drifted, carrying echoes of orders once barked, boots once marched. But here, in this still room, she felt only the fragile triumph of one secret kindness that had survived the machinery of war. That night, she sat by her window, candlelight flickering across the metal on her dresser, untouched, undesired. It was for bravery under fire, but she wondered if true bravery was ever loud. Perhaps it lived in whispers, in defiance carried out under a leaking roof, in choosing to save rather than obey. The radio crackled with news of trials in Nuremberg. Words like justice, guilt, punishment filled the airwaves, yet all Claire could think of was a photograph of a mother and child folded in a soldier's trembling hand. She realized then that every side had its ghosts, and mercy, that quiet, unrecorded act, was the only thing that could make peace mean something more than silence. Outside, snow began to fall. She stepped out onto the porch, letting the flakes melt against her skin. The night was still, the kind of stillness that feels earned. Somewhere across the ocean, she imagined a small boy being told a story.